is Australia introducing a wealth tax? Well, I bet a lot of you would have seen the headlines and the news around changes to the way that superannuation is going to be taxed in Australia. So there's going to be taxes on unrealised gains. These are assets that have not been sold, so the gain doesn't actually exist. There's also issues around the thresholds, the $3 million threshold not being indexed to inflation. While the Treasurer Jim Chalmers does say that these changes are modest, a lot of people are asking, is this just the tip of the iceberg? What else is to come down the pipeline? If you're an Australian with significant assets, your super might be first, but then what about trusts? What about inheritance payments? What about the family home? In this video, we're going to break this down from an international standpoint and give you a bit of understanding about what is being looked at here with these tax changes and what are the possible motivations behind it. In 2025, Australia is introducing a new tax on superannuation balances over $3 million. So what makes this controversial? Well, unrealised gains are going to be taxed. Even if your fund hasn't sold the asset, you pay tax on that asset as if it had already made that gain. Further, the $3 million threshold is not being indexed to inflation. They say there's about 80,000 taxpayers that are going to be caught up in this initially, but over time that is going to grow significantly, meaning more Australians are going to get caught up in this superannuation tax change. Of course, the whole marketing campaign around this is tax the rich, as it often is with a new tax. But the fact that inflation isn't factored in 30 years' time, $3 million isn't going to be a great deal of money. I know that sounds crazy, but with all the money printing that goes on these days and all the debasement of our currency, of our savings being devalued, your superannuation balance could actually hit that $3 million threshold sooner than you think. And there've actually been studies done, AMP did one, I think a few others have, showing how young workers today who are 20 years old, if they're on a good professional salary, how they probably will have a $3 million superannuation balance by the time they retire. So in 30 years' time and out ahead of that, it's not going to be so much about taxing the rich, it's going to be about taxing the middle class and taxing aspiration. When you think about it, what is happening here is actually quite clever if you were approaching it from a tax collector's standpoint. Let's play a bit of a thought experiment here. Let's just say you were going to come up with a plan to create a giant tax trap. Now, how would you go about it? You'd probably create some kind of investment or retirement savings vehicle. You'd incentivize people to pump it with contributions by offering generous tax concessions. Over time, you would legislate to raise the minimum contribution amounts that employers have to put into this investment vehicle on behalf of their staff. You'd probably also increase the annual contribution limits, and you'd allow people to roll forward unused contributions from previous years to make bigger contributions today. All the while in the name of growing your superannuation balance, getting good tax deductions along the way, and being a self-funded retiree. So you do this for 30 odd years, and the result now, as a nation, you have one of the biggest pools of retirement funds in the world. The superannuation industry is massive on a global scale. Of course, you limit access to withdrawals, you have to wait till you're retired to get it, and you might even push up the retirement age, meaning people have to wait longer to get to their money. And you may even make changes around how people can use that money to effectively not allow people to use it for passing down to their children, but forcing them to take that money out and put it into the economy. Now, all of a sudden, you have all this money in these retirement accounts. The government is licking their lips thinking, how can we get our hands on this giant stash of cash? So what do? You move the goalposts. All of these years, you've followed the rules, followed the incentives, you've done what you were told to do, thinking that you are setting yourself up for retirement, but also taking care of your family into the future. And then the government turns around and says, okay, sorry, no, we're actually going to tax you double on this now. But even though we're sort of reneging on our deal for it to be a tax-advantaged retirement investment vehicle, we're still not going to allow you to get to it, but we're going to take that tax money anyway. You have to admit, if you were plotting against this kind of scheme over a long period of time, you've gone about it in a very clever fashion. You've turned one of the biggest pools of funds in the world into a giant tax grab. It really is quite clever if you look at it over the longer term, but I'm sure a lot of you will have different words that you'd use to describe it. So why are people worried about a broader wealth tax? Well, this is where things get a bit political and where many Australians feel uneasy. It's a slippery slope. Where does it go from here? Once you sort of open up the door, you get your foot in, what's going to happen after that? Taxing unrealised gains is a little bit unconventional in international tax systems. Yes, it does get talked about, usually by the left side of politics and other politicians and think tanks who have more of a sort of a socialist mindset. That's just a fact. But in recent years, it is getting talked about a bit more. It's getting discussed in the media, some publications more than others. You probably know who they are. And usually when stuff does start getting talked about in the media, that's sort of like the beginning phase of it, just trying to kind of get the public used to this sort of strange idea. The more they read about it, the more people are talking about it, the less strange that idea then sounds, and the more likely it is to get support in an election or even just receive less opposition going through a parliamentary system. To be next, we know they don't like splitting income in trusts, which is a perfectly legal and legitimate way of doing business. They serve a legitimate purpose. Government doesn't like it. Inheritance, we know they've got their eyes on that. They really do not like super being used as an inheritance tool. And the family home, what's going to happen there? That is one of the biggest tax deductions in Australia that everyone benefits from if they own a home, that is. And there was a really good interview recently with Christopher Joy on I think it's the Straight Talk podcast with Mark Boris. And he was saying that this is basically an attack on self-managed super funds. They don't want self-managed super funds. They want everyone in regulated funds. And people who have the ability to liquidate self-managed funds, they're probably going to put that money into the family home because that is tax-free. So if that is sort of what's going to happen, then the next logical point is for the government to look at tax on the family home. Of course, this is all speculation, but people out there, commentators, respected commentators, are certainly discussing motives for this and the potential future direction for this taxation policy. And while the government denies any broader wealth tax plans, we know from history that when these frameworks are implemented, they tend to expand. That is usually how these things go. So how does this fit into a global trend? Well, Australia isn't unique. Countries like Canada, the US, several countries in the EU have debated or implemented similar wealth-based taxes. France's wealth tax led to capital flight until it was reformed. Argentina introduced a one-off wealth tax during COVID. And you could also argue that the Victorian government in Australia has introduced their own wealth taxes with the supposedly temporary 10-year taxes that they've put on stamp duty and other things. And of course, the OECD has been openly advocating for wealth-based taxes in its member countries. And our good friend, former Australian politician, Liberal politician I might add, Matthias Cormann, heads up that organisation. So it's not just the left side of politics, they're all sort of getting in on the party here. So if you're thinking about long-term asset protection, if this is important to you, it really is essential to have a bit of an idea of where your country sits on this spectrum. Are they a country that respects private ownership, that encourages aspiration and wealth building and looking after your family and not being dependent on the state? Or does your country have more kind of socialist goals? So what can Australians do about a wealth tax? Well, if you're concerned, there are a few options that you can consider. They can be reviewing your residency status. The ATO has the right to tax worldwide income. But if you are a non-resident, you exit the Australian tax system, you go live somewhere else, then the Australian government can no longer tax your overseas assets. They can still tax income earned from within Australia, but anything earned overseas is off limits. You can look at diversifying your asset structures and how you go about investing. Here I'm talking about companies, trusts, and so on. It's not always a 100% or easy fix, but you definitely can still use structures to shield yourself from taxes. If you have a bit of money at stake, it wouldn't be a terrible idea to consult with professionals about succession planning and estate planning to make sure that your hard-earned money is going to your children and not going to the state, basically. And this isn't about not paying taxes, it's about tax money being used inappropriately. So a lot of people who are looking to shield themselves from taxation are happy to pay their fair share, but they don't want to see their money go and be wasted on basically fraud and other mismanagement in the public sector economy. And of course, be ready to adapt. Things can change quickly, but often with a lot of this stuff, like we're saying, we get a bit of warning about this. It gets put out in the media, then politicians start talking about it, then they're having a roundtable on it. Next thing you know, it's getting introduced or they're trying to put it through Parliament. So to wrap it up, guys, no one can predict where this is going. What we do know is that when things get introduced, they get introduced on a small scale, and if history is to repeat itself, these small things generally grow into bigger things over time. Staying informed to what is going on in your country with their tax policy is a big part of it, and being ready to adapt and planning ahead and willing to make moves if you feel that things are getting a bit too uncomfortable or you don't like where the direction it's going. There are things you can do to shield yourself from this, whether it's corporate structuring or whether it's making a bigger move by, for example, leaving the tax system. Until next time, guys, thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay aware, and stay ahead of the curve. We'll see you later.